for having me. I thought I was doing this talk later, so I apologize if you guys are waiting on me, but let me go ahead and share my screen, which hopefully, oh, here we go. Let me find it here. Okay. All right. Can you guys see my screen? Looks like it. Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about component testing with Cypress, which is something that we released basically with Cypress 10, which came out back in June. So it's just almost 2 months old. And we released that with support for React and some of its it's some of its frameworks like Next.js and Create, React App, and so forth, and then also Vue support. But we didn't have Angular support. But actually, we are getting ready to release support for Angular, and I wanted to give you guys a quick demo of it so you guys have a feel for it. But I wanted to first share a little bit more about what it is and why you would care about it, that kind of stuff. So first, I guess, so it adds a little context who I am. So I'm not just some stranger talking, across the internet waves to you guys. My name is Jordan Powell. I'm a developer experience engineer at Cypress. Um, and you can find me on Twitter at JordanPowell88, or you can check out my blog at jordanpowell.online. But enough about me. Today, I wanted to just do like a quick intro into Cypress component testing in Angular, do a demo of it, and then do a quick Q&A. So it's going to be super informal. If you guys have questions, feel free to stop me at any point. But I'll also open up time at the end to answer questions you guys might have. So before we get into it, I wanted to first I always like to ask the question, like, why? Like, there's millions and, it feels like millions. There's like an infinite number of technologies and tools and things like that out there. And so I think it's always good to ask the question, why? Because, like, why should I take the time to not only adopt this tool, but also learn the tool and then ultimately my team learn this tool, that kind of thing. So I think it's important to always ask the question why. But the reason why we created component testing at Cypress is that, for those of you who are not familiar with Cypress, we are primarily been known as an end-to-end testing tool. So similar to like Protractor or Selenium, things like that. But if you've ever used Cypress, I'm sure you've found that your experience using it is significantly better, much more fun, and easier to work with. Um, and so we used to always think of websites as in terms of pages. Like we would build websites based upon, I need a home page and I need an about page and so forth, like that. And we do somewhat still do that, but we used to really think, as developers, we used to think of our applications in the terms of like pages. So we think of it as like one big box of a page that had all the things that that page needs to do. Um, but over the last, I don't know, I would say like 5 years or so, we've kind of learned to make a switch into going from pages to components. So we realized that our application, like our those pages that we used to build, are comprised of much smaller units. And if we could create smaller units, there are some certain benefits to that. One being, a lot of pages have shared things between pages, right? We have the same menu bar, maybe the same footer, maybe same buttons, things like that are shared across your application that we used to just like copy and paste, right? But with components, you sort of encapsulate all that logic, the behaviors, the look and feel, all that kind of stuff in a way that makes it reusable and shareable. So now created uh, we've we've sort of migrated from pages to components. And so one of the things uh, that's great about component testing is that it really, we've sort of moved to something what we call it component driven development, which the reason why we have this is because a lot of there's been an acceleration and adoption of component driven development and frameworks. So frameworks like Angular, React, Vue, other frameworks that basically adopted this idea of a component and said, let's make our apps not necessarily pages, but based upon a bunch of components that work together to basically represent your application. And what so the adoption and the rapid acceleration of those frameworks has really sort of helped uh, sort of establish a component driven development. Another thing that has sort of driven this change is that there used to be we a lot of times we were all like on all in one team, but now we have multiple teams that are all work on maybe the same product or maybe not even the same product, but they have shared parts. So autonomous teams helps make this. Also, we need code that's more scalable and decoupled. And so by encapsulating the logic and so forth of components, we make it more scalable and decouple it. And again, reuse and consistency, the more, instead of having to copy and paste, parts of our application over and over and over again, we are able to reuse it and get consistency across the board that we like. And then improve maintainability. So obviously, as developers, one of the things I hate doing the most is once I build something, like I want to move on to the next new thing. So making something that's maintainable, that is something you don't have to keep doing little PRs over, bugs fixes. The less of that you can do as a developer, the more you can move forward with building the things we most care about. The other big benefit of component testing is you sort of inherently get it, almost enforces test driven development, or TDD, which a lot of, it's kind of a buzzword that we've been tossed around in the testing environment for many years. But component testing almost really like naturally lends itself to that. And the reason why is because you end up building your components in isolation. Um, be, because you test components at a micro level, basically the component level only. If you use it during the creation of the component itself, you'll find your experience with creating the component and tweaking it, making sure the styles look right, the behavior works perfectly. You'll find using it actually during this stage, it actually improves and speeds up the creation of the component, and also helps like uh, you get like better assertions along the way. So, anyways, you do it up front and at the beginning, but then in the end, you still have this functioning test that you're left with that makes sure the behavior works as expected and so forth. Um, and the reason why is because you have isolated components. So again, when we used to build a component, we would build it on a page. So we would say, yeah, I need a new button, or I need a card that looks like this. Well, we used to have to like build this inside of inside of like our page or website, in the context of everything else. But now we can really just build our components in isolation by themselves, so that way parent styles, things like that, we don't want to care about at this stage. We want to know that this component by itself, how it works, how it behaves in isolation, and then we can begin to embed it in amongst other things to ensure that it works as expected. The other thing is something I want to talk about is called shift. Basically, component testing by nature sort of enforces this notion of shifting left. And what that means is, historically in software, you would this is like the process you would go through. So you'd have like, you'd identify system requirements, then you would then turn those into software requirements. From there, you would do some sort of analysis, then you would do a program design of what it's going to look like, then you would begin coding, and then you would finally do testing before it became operational. Well, this is fine except for the fact that you're doing testing at the very, very end of this diagram. And the idea of shifting left is basically trying to move testing further left in this diagram so that it's done as soon as possible. So any problems, anything like that, you can catch early on. So that way testing doesn't become like this last second stopgap safety measure, though it can become that, and it still is that, but it can also be something that helps drive decisions, even in the program design, analysis, software requirements, things like that earlier on in the process. Okay, so let's get started into a little bit something more specifically into component testing now that we know a little bit more of the why. So in order to get started with Cypress, we would just need to run npm install Cypress at the latest version. And it doesn't need to be a dependency. It can just be a dev dependency in our application. And then from here, you're going to the new Cypress 10 runner, which changed in 10.0, gives you the option to have end-to-end testing, which is what it's historically been known for, but also gives you the option to pick component testing. And so the setup will look like this. You pick component testing, and then it's going to walk you through some steps that we'll actually do here in a second. But the one thing I wanted to note is that the migration step from 9 to 10, there was breaking changes. And Cypress, we put a strong emphasis on making that migration step and process as smooth as possible, right? But I put together a guide and a video that helps answer questions, walk through the specifics of that migration process. So if any of you are maybe are just learning about Cypress 10 and want to migrate, or maybe are skeptical about upgrading to 10, I would be happy to share this link with you later. But there's a guide that I wrote that can help with assisting in this process. So what are the differences between end-to-end and component testing? Now that we've you saw from that launchpad, we have two different testing types. Well, the main differences are this. So with end-to-end testing, you would run Cypress, but you'd also have to, it had no like dev server or anything to actually serve your application. Your application, you would have to run in like a separate process. You would like run ng-serve, and it would serve your application on most likely port 4200. And then in another terminal window or tab or something like that, you would then run Cypress, and then you would then tell Cypress to visit your local dev server, which will serve your application. With component testing, that's different. When you pick component testing, you're not loading your app. You're just literally want to essentially mount that any single component in isolation by itself, but it needs a dev server to do that. So Cypress, with component testing, it actually uses your Angular .json file, and it can infer how your project is basically configured and create a dev server for you that will best match and suit mounting your components. The other main thing that I just kind of mentioned a little bit, but with Cypress, the intent testing, the first step you normally take is site at visit. So you're visiting a URL. Once you visited the URL, you can then, interact with the DOM, make assertions and things like that. But we're not visiting a URL anymore because we're not visiting a route. We're mounting a component. So instead of visit, we're now using a new API method called mount. The other thing to note is in end-to-end testing, you're visiting the page where all your components and all the parts sort of live together. In fact, Cypress is just seeing the exact same thing your browser sees. It's not seeing what framework you're using. It doesn't care if you're using Angular or React, or doesn't even care if you're using JavaScript. It's just rendering. It's just reading the DOM itself, so the HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and it then knows how to do its things. Well, components are different. It cares specifically about the frameworks and how your components are constructed and things like that. So it's testing not everything as a whole. It's testing your components in isolation. And then finally, we're testing different things. So things that you would care about with, say, an end-to-end test, you're going to test some different things. There is going to be a lot of similarities, but and the API for component testing and intent testing is the same. But there may be some subtle differences that you would check. For example, you're not going to have any routing in component testing where you may route from one flow to the next in an intent test and make certain assertions. So let me kind of hit that a little bit more in detail. So typically in an intent test, you would test as like what we would call like a user journey, or basically the path that a user would take in order to test, like to complete a journey in your application. So in this case, a user searches for a product, they then add that product to a cart, they then go to the cart, enter their shipping information, they then enter their payment information, and then they complete the order. Well, that would be considered like one specific user journey that you would write an intent test for. Well, this is like not how you do it with component testing. What you do with component testing is you would test the individual components. So the search bar would be a specific test. The shopping cart button would be a specific test. The shipping form, the payment form, the order summary. You get the point, right? So we're testing the very specific parts in isolation, not the entire thing, right? So that's the quick intro into that. So now is going to switch to the demo, if that is okay. Does anyone have any questions, I guess, while I'm here? While I switch. Okay. Looks like not. Let's see. I'm going to have to hang on. Switch my screen here. 1 second. And hopefully you can see this. I have a big monitor, so let me know if this doesn't work for some reason, but hopefully this helps. So here, let me share the screen. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see. Let me zoom in for anyone who needs to see that, and I can zoom in here too. But here we have basically an Angular application it's an Angular 14 app, but it could be. Hello,
Jordan. Sorry.
no problem.
Yeah, I think it's pretty it's
It's pretty small, yeah.
pretty long.
Let
Yeah.
me try something else. Let me try
Okay.
sharing. Let me just try sharing. I'll just have to keep swapping back and forth. I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem.
Okay, window. Okay. Let me share. It's not showing VS Code as an option. Hmm. Well,
It's a huge screen.
yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Okay, it's not letting me. Let me. I'll zoom it in, and we'll have to make this work hopefully as much as possible. So basically, it I have an Angular, just an Angular CLI project, and I installed Cypress 10, and this is basically what you would get once this gets released. So you'd run npx Cypress open here, and you'll see. Hopefully, you can maybe see this a little bit. Cypress would then open and say, "Hey, I don't have at this moment, I don't have end-to-end testing or component testing configured," but you click component testing, it would automatically detect that you're using Angular. or if you're using other frameworks, it would recognize that. But it show Angular detection. It's going to look through our dependencies and make sure everything we need is installed, which it is. We press continue, and then it's going to basically tell us the configuration files it's going to create for us, which is going to be a Cypress config file, which we used to use the Cypress.json file in version 9 and I guess older. But Cypress 10 and older uses a config file, gives us a lot more flexibility and options, creating a support file for components. And then it says it would create a component index file and some samples. So here we are. It's going to go ahead and start this. And I know you can't see super well, but I will try to, hopefully it'll be a little helpful. So here it's going to pick up, I have some tests written, and hopefully you can here, if you're familiar with Cypress, you get all the same sort of thing. There's a button that I have. Here's a login form. It just ran like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tests. Very quick, basically assertion. So this test is making sure it can mount. This test mounts it, make sure it contains password. It finds the input, then expect it to have certain type. Here, we're checking that this displays correctly, and then we have just a bunch of different assertions. We're spying on certain things. You get all the same things you're used to with Cypress, but you're only testing one part at a time. So here's another component, which is a will component, which has a button component inside of it. So the welcome component has multiple components, but it renders itself because it's a parent, and it will render the children components themselves too. And here's like the root level component as well. So you can wrap, like you could do component testing for specific pages or routes or something like that. But the main important thing is that you can test like a very, very even, like elementary, like beginning, very small isolated area, I guess, if that makes sense. So let me open this up. And again, you saw this is a component test. This is the config that it created. And then here, now I just have is inside, which has just basically an output that gets emitted when the button gets clicked, right? We just emit this thing. And so we render this component. And what we do is Cypress uses with 10.0 uses .sci.ts as the default basically spec pattern. So here you see we just described the button. We then do sci.mount. We then pass it the component we want, and then we do assertions on it. Let me show a good example, which would be like this login form, which has lots of tests on it. So here, the login, if you see, I'm going to show you the API of this. So you run sci.mount, and then here, the first thing it's going to do is take in a component. And then the second thing you're going to do is an interface that I created called testbed config, which extends the normal like Angular testbed configuration that gives you things like imports, declarations, providers. So we're using the same sort of Angular testbed that you're familiar with, and then just extend it to add a few additional supports. So like here, we're going to say, I want to use this login imported like how you normally would. And then the next, I'm just going to pass in this object, which again, you're going to see imports, providers, declarations. And then we have an additional property called component properties, which is like similar to like React, like props or something like that. But the idea is that if your component, if you need to basically access any of the public like properties or methods or anything on that. So for example, like the on the login form, if we look at it, there is an input that there is an input property called error message that this property takes as an input, and then there's also like an output that gets emitted that emits the username and password when the login form basically gets completed, as well as like internal properties, this method, things like that. So here you actually get strong typing, and you can say, hey, I want to pass it the error message, and I want to tell it to be like, hello, Angular Kenya, something like that. And then it's okay, now I want to, you know, on login form, password, you get all these same sort of things. So, and then from there, it literally just like, it just mounts. So if I go back to Cypress, we can go here, login form. So now this test is going to fail. But it's because I also don't have it's erroring because this component is using the ng form, and what I'm doing is up here I'm defining this config, which I'm passing in side of here, which I'm not doing. So what we want to do here is we want to like spread this config and then add this. I spelled that wrong too. So if I save this, focus this, you can see now the test is passing. And if I go here, it's saying hello, Angular Kenya. And then the cool thing is okay, I don't want this. Let me just go back to how we had this. But then let's go back to, I don't know, the welcome component, which we could see is like a root div. It then takes a input property of username, and it has an output of on logout. But the username then gets displayed here. So it'll say welcome username. And then when you click the button, which was this other component, it emits a value. So the welcome component, we're telling it that it needs, because it renders a child component, we need to declare that button like you would in an Angular test. Here as a declaration, you want to declare the button component. And then here we're telling it, hey, I want to pass it a username property, input property to test user. And then I want to you can then do set up spies. So the response of this mount is actually gives you three things. It gives you the something called a mount response, which, see if I can get typing for that maybe. Yeah, it's not going to show, but basically it gives you the component itself, the component instance, the fixture, and the test bed. So you can do could do other things, like if you needed to like fixture.detect changes manually, because you said like response.component dot I wanted to trigger all and emit this, or you get additional things that are what you should be used to with Angular component testing. But here, I want to test like how you would basically test an output, which is a pretty common thing you would do. And so here I'm taking the response and getting the component on logout property, which is an event emitter, and then I'm going to spy on the emit method that gets evoked on this. So if I create a spy on this and basically set an alias to on logout, then like down here you could see, and if I click the button, I can then make sure that it has been called. So you can do lots of Cypressy things. You can also do, for example, then let me show you one final thing here, then I'll answer some questions. But for example, this is a task that basically makes a post request to 200. And then once the user's logged in, it loads a different component that says welcome, and then the user the basically the username that was typed in here. So this username then gets put into this next component. When you click login, it will make a HTTP request to this auth endpoint, and here it shows what happens when it returns like a 400. So this test, though, this would be like difficult to do with protractor or something like this. So here, when you want to validate works correctly, you just use SIDA interstep, which is something you use with end-to-end testing as well. You then just say, hey, I want to make sure it returns a status code of 200, and this is the body that my component uses to determine how that component handles the state itself. And then same thing here, we're posting to the same endpoint, but instead we're doing a 401 and we're turning this message, which then gets displayed in the component. So hopefully that gives like a super high level. I know it went really quick, but you guys have been waiting around for a long time. So hopefully that was worth the wait. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I think just to highlight, I think we had one of our attendees was interested in like really getting to have a sneak peek on how we could do it. Testing the Angular project with Cypress, because he mentioned that they're moving from Selenium to Cypress. So I don't know, Joel, yes. What do you think about it? Joel, you there? Okay. Oh yeah. Yeah. Hey. So I was just mentioning that you are really interested in this talk because you mentioned that your company is moving towards or migrating to testing with Cypress from Selenium. So I don't know, what do you think about this so far?
Yeah, it's very it's new knowledge. We were only looking at the end-to-end test, but now with the component testing, it looks interesting, and it's something we look into implementing too. But you've said that Angular support for Angular is not ready yet.
The support for that should be out within the next week or so. It's very, very close. So,
thank you.
It should be on our next release or the following.
All right. So currently we are implementing the end-to-end implementation.
Okay.
Once the Angular support is ready, we'll jump on that too.
Awesome. Cool. And one of the other things that is one of my favorite parts about doing tests like this too is I never really liked. I used to. There's a couple of things. One is your components that you end up like when you generate a new component in Angular and it creates like a karma test for you. It was always kind of difficult to test like the DOM interactions and things like that themselves because it doesn't actually like render in the DOM. It just renders it in like JS DOM or like a virtual DOM kind of. But like with Cypress, it actually loads like in Chrome or whatever browser you pick on a dev server, like in a very real world environment. And so you get a much clearer picture, not only visually, but also from a assurance standpoint, like, hey, this like it's going to actually work in a browser the way I expected to. And then the other thing too is it always amazed me. I think like when you create when you do like ng generate and it creates like a new karma test for you, it's like 25 lines long just to like basically essentially do the equivalent of mounting the component, which it can be done in like 5 lines long with Cypress component testing for Angular. So that's one of my things is it eliminates a lot of the boilerplate. It wraps around Angular's test bed, so we're not so you're getting the same you're using the same technology and the same tools that you're sort of that you've used in the past, but we're just wrapping around it in a way that makes it work with Cypress and makes it less boilerplate and more like ergonomically like friendly, I guess.
Yeah, sounds amazing.
Yeah, and I think also just to add on to that, we even in our company we had started working with Cypress for testing, and I think this news of support for Angular component testing is a huge win for us because we were mostly just doing the end to end. So the component testing will really become a really huge part of our testing, a good testing experience. So we look forward to that, and I think it's good that we've actually here at Angular Kenya we've got like that first seat on how it's going to look like. So yeah, we do look forward to it.
Awesome. Well, that's all I have. I know it's a little all over the place, but wasn't I wasn't I thought I was giving this talk like later, so the time zones are always mess me up. But hopefully it was helpful. And if any of you guys have additional like questions or whatever, feel free to reach out to me and on Twitter or LinkedIn or however, and I'm happy to answer additional questions.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And just as a heads up, if in case you feel like you've probably lost or something, I'm just going to ask Jordan to just kind of like share any resources which he thinks will be helpful, and we are going to always post them in the video description so that you can be able to find any additional stuff that you might need. And I don't know, maybe at some point we'll invite Jordan once again to kind of like do a refresher on this in case there'll be comments on a bit of confusion and all that. And if you have any questions, also you can reach out to Jordan at any time. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it from us. If there's no question, I'd like to bring the session to a close. I'd like to say a big thank you to Jordan. Thank you for taking the time. Again, apologies for the miscommunication in that. But thank you for also taking the time to like do this, even if it was on such a short notice. Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Appreciate it.
So